I'm Virgealia Looney Ellis. My first name is Denny. Denny Virgealia Looney Ellis. I'm a Appalachian woman. My mother came from Southwest Virginia, from the coal mines, Stonega, Virginia. My daddy came from Hawkins County, Burgoynesville. So I have the heart of Appalachia in my blood. I've eaten the food out of the ground. I've smelled the air. I've trudged in the snow, and I've waded in the water. I'm truly a person who loves the mountains, the valleys, the people, the air, the animals. My grandmother told the story that when she was sitting in her yard, she saw all these good-looking men of color coming. And she said she just took her breath away, and she saw one. And she very bravely went up to him and said, "You're the prettiest man I've ever seen in my life. If you marry me, you won't have to work a lick the rest of your life." Grandma was a very industrious woman. She was a leader. She was always ahead of something. She built a school for the little colored children down where she lived, and built a church. And she was just that energetic person. Grandma also worked for the mayor of Burgoynesville. She took care of the mayor's children, and she knew all the business that went on in Burgoynesville. And my dad grew up there too, because he did little chores. All right, he didn't want to do chores anymore, so he went to the mine. He and his cousin went to the mines in Stonega, Virginia. And they ate at a boarding house. And that was my grandmother and grandfather's boarding house. And Grandma always had the meals for the miners who were single. And the two cousins went to the grandma's house and met her two daughters. So two cousins married sisters. One was my aunt and my cousin, and the other one was my daddy and my mother, so we cross-related. My parents were hired by the Avoca company, a Uniqueness company, that was formed by J. Fred Johnson, John B. Dennis, and other dignitaries along with the Dobbins family. These men who had a vision, they loved railroads. In fact, it was Mr. Dennis, John B. Dennis, who had a vision, because he worked for Blair and Company out of New York City, which was a big company for banking and finance and for investment. And he was asked to come to Nashville, Tennessee, to set up a financial system to run this little state. In fact, it's not a little state. We were 500 miles long, so it's a long state with lots of land, lots of resources. And he took up the offer and traveled to Nashville, Tennessee, which was in its infancy, and set up a financial system. And when he did that, then he found out not only did we have the natural resources like the coal, we had the trees, and he didn't talk very much, but he liked the people. He said they are receptive, they're welcoming, and they want to work. And when Mr. John B. Dennis found out about Mr. J. Fred Johnson, one was a planner, Mr. J. Fred Johnson was a visionary. he could get things done. He was a politician. He was a maker of things to happen. And then here was a man who had money and worked with money and understood numbers. The two became fast friends. From the Unica company, then we had the Kingsport Improvement Company. And they were the ones who helped buy this land from old man Carter. And over the 6,000 acres, we had another family here that was very strong. They were smart people, smart children. They bought about 2,000 acres of that 6,000 and set up Rotherwood Farms. The Rotherwood Farms was a very, it was unique. They only dealt with products that were unusual and were financially able to support. Say, for instance, the dairy farm, the dairy part. Let's go into cattle raising, not the regular Holstein cows. Let's get the Jersey cows, the ones that give the pure milk. They are pure. Let's invest in prize bulls. Let's have a farm that we raise our own food and we sell it to the city. So it became Rotherwood Farms. And Mr. Dobbins had about 5 or 6 children, and all of his sons. Even one was the State Farm Bureau director. And he was my favorite person. He treated me, I was a little girl at Rotherwood running around, the only little child. And Hal, his name was H-O-W-E, Hal Dobbins. Every time he would come at Rotherwood, he'd pat me on my head and, hey, little girl, and I just thought that was great. But anyway, Rotherwood became then almost like a place that was dignified, cultured, had a butler, had a chauffeur, had a chef, who was my mother, Chef Tish, she had called herself. And they entertained manufacturers to come in and build up this city, to build up this town, to bring in money and improve the people of the mountains surrounding this area. And they had the money, they didn't have to worry. The money was there. It was just the vision and the stick-to-itiveness that kept it through. So Rotherwood became like a big-time meeting house or place of recreation. And the hardest person, this is what I was growing up, the hardest person to encourage, to sell, to bring in industry was George Eastman. And of course, you know, who wants to come to a dinky mountain town? And Mr. Dennis, being from the northern part of the United States, I think he was born in Maine. Yeah, he was born in Maine. And he was accustomed, his father was a banker also. So he had class. And of course, Mr. J. Fred learned his class because of the people he wanted to associate with. They had class themselves. So Rotherwood was just a meeting place for everybody they wanted to court, to bring in here, to produce jobs. Then how are we going to get the products out? We need a railroad. So the guys got together, put in their minds and everything, and started the railroad because Mr. Carter had started it from infancy, but he just didn't have enough people with him to back it. But anyway, with Mr. Dennis's love and everything, well, we got the CC's I've forgotten the name of the railroad, Clinchfield Railroad. And then, along with Mr. J. Johnson, they devised complementary companies that would be supportive for Eastman. So we got Slipknot Belt, we got Holston Mills, we got the publishing house, we got Mead. All of those companies supported. There was a romance, a fellowship that supported Eastman. Now, in the meantime, Rotherwood, I grew up with horses, hunting, dogs. I knew all the spaniels. I knew all the hound dogs. Those were hunting dogs, and we had a carriage. I barely remember it, but when, as we say, the big shots would come in at Rotherwood, we'd be on our finest behavior. My dad would go to the stables, and he would bring this big wagon up to the wall in front of Rotherwood House. It was like a wall that we would bring the horses, and they would stand there at the wall. You'd give them a little bit of sugar and ready to be mounted or whatever. That was the finest carriage that you could see anywhere. The seats were black upholstered. I remember them. A big seat was cushioned back here, another seat here. The dog kennel was in the back of the seats. On the side where you step up, there was a little part there that was almost blank, but that's where the rifles were, on the side of it, and seats in the front. So you got your dogs, you got your rifles, you got your cushioned carriage. It was just as fine as anybody could have, even if you were from the state of New York. Click, got Mr. Eastman here. And that started the romance of building this place to get products out to the coast, to the east, the south, the north, and the west. The company had already built a cottage for Mama and Daddy to live in. We lived on the third floor. They lived on the third floor in the big mansion. But my dad and Mama complained of ghosts. So Mama said, I'm not cooking anymore. I'm not doing anything until you find a place for us to live, and I'm not going up and down these steps. So they built a cottage for Mom and Dad, and they put in the most extensive, intricate system, heating system that you'd ever heard of in the eastern southern part of the United States. They put a stoker in the cottage, in the basement, and put conduits or pipes or whatever under the ground and put them in the big house with the 3 stories, and put in radiators with steam heat. People from all over, they said, I don't remember much about that, but they said people had never heard of it, and you could hear them popping, boo-boo, and the heat would come on, and it was just magic, you know. You don't have to have the fireplaces. I have a story that I always tell about Mr. Figgins, who was just like Mr. Green Jeans on Captain Kangaroo. And really, he was my babysitter during the day, because I would go up, because Mrs. Dennis had formal gardens. She had English gardens and all kinds of flowers. He taught me the names of, even from delphinias to all kinds of flowers. I knew all the flowers and everything. And I stayed with him most of the day. And her formal garden was kind of, here's Rotherwood, here's the circle. We had a drive-in circle. And from the circle there were steps, and mounted, it looked like it was on on a mount platform, but it was this formal garden with bricked in and little, it was just, it was manufactured, it was period, just a beautiful garden. And on this knoll, sometimes the house was sitting down here, I would holler, ah, scream or something, and I'd hear it. And I thought that was so funny that I could hear myself scream. And I asked Mr. Lonnie, something about what. He said, honey, that's the echo. I said, well, what, why? He said, I don't know. I guess it's God speaking. I don't know, he didn't know. But he told me how the sound would bounce off of the house and come back, So when I would go to the house, down to the house at the end of the day or in the middle of the day, Mama would say, what you doing? What'd you do today, honey? I said, I talked to God. Okay. She wore little high heel shoes and her little uniform, pantsing around. And so she took it. And after a while, she got tired asking us something. I'd have forgotten how all of that came about. And she said, well, did he talk back to you? And I said, yes. Boy, she ran out of the kitchen and ran up to across the circle and was pouncing on poor old Mr. Lonnie. What are you teaching? What's the matter? What's going on and everything? He said, well, Miss Inez, it's just that she talked out and made an echo. And Mama said, oh, well, I'm glad that's all it was. I thought you were teaching her something or putting something in her head, and he was about, no, ma'am, no, ma'am, no, ma'am. But that stayed with me all of my life, that I felt like I had talked to God, and God answered back. I could say hello, and he would say hello. And I'd say, I love you. I love you. And to me, it just seemed like, I don't know whether that was a road map or anything, but I can still hear that echo. And I tell that story because it's a thing that I had no control of. It's the energy of something around us that we can't fathom, but it's a part of us. And it's hard to explain, but it's there. And if you're able to generate that, then that powers you up. I don't know, that's just part of my philosophy. It's strange, that came from the earth.